Good morning, everyone. My name is David Caldwell, and I'm glad you were able to find time to attend today. It's the AP payment approval process. I think that what you will learn to do today, if you have not already deployed this particular feature within Intacct, you will find this a fairly straightforward process, a very easy process to implement within the Intacct system, and find that there will be a way for you to be able to eliminate what otherwise might be manual responsibilities among multiple people, especially when it comes to payments within the accounts payable Intacct system. So let's talk a little bit about the accounts payable system, and just to kind of settle some of the foundational components here before we get started too far into it. That's the first thing that I want to do here. The second thing is that I'm going to go through the setup elements within the accounts payable system that will be leading toward the actual operation and the process and procedures of the accounts payable check approval. And then we'll actually go through a short demonstration as to how this works, all the way to the point of watching emails that come to a recipient, as well as going through the approval process, as well as notification to an individual who is needing to know that certain checks have been approved to carry on with the next step, which would be the check approval process. So that's just a broad overview of this part of the system. In order to set this up, you do need to at least be a business user with administrative rights, particularly having to do with users and permissions, as well as the accounts payable configuration part of the Intacct system. This is really what is necessary in order for you to be able to navigate into the specific areas in order to get this set up. So I want to make sure that you understand that this isn't something that an employee user within the system can set up. It's not something just a casual business user can set up, but it is something that does require some administrative rights in order to at least get this part of the system set up. The second thing is that I want to make sure that we all understand foundationally is that inside of the accounts payable system, when we talk about the approval process, and this is contrasted against the purchase order part of Intacct, the accounts payable system approval process is for the purpose of approving selected bills that are slated to be paid. That is in contrast to approving bills to be posted to the system. So there's a bit of a distinction here that you all must understand, is that there is not an approval process to enter bills into the system, but there is an approval process that once bills have been selected to be paid is where the approval process within accounts payable begins and allows for the next step to take place, and that is to print checks, send ACHs, record transfers, record manual checks in the system. So there is that subtle distinction. Now that's in contrast to the purchase order system, whereby in the purchase order system the approval process is a much more comprehensive type of system in terms of its approval process, and many different layers that can be set up in terms of where things get approved, how they get approved. The purchase order system is beyond the scope of what we're going to be talking about today, but I think it's important that at least that you understand the distinctions there between the two modules and the subtle distinction between approving a bill, of which accounts payable doesn't do, versus approving a selected bill that is slated to be paid. So with having that set aside and at least understood, I want to take you through the setup elements of the system. And I want to first start off by focusing on the user. That is going to be one of the key elements here and part of the success here. And oftentimes when this part of the system is set up, there sometimes are elements that are forgotten and may not be set up, and wondering, and the next question that comes is wondering why the accounts payable approval process system is not working. So I want to take you to some examples that I've set up in this sample company called Harley Dave. The first one is that I want to take you to the users that we've set up in here. And there happens to be a user out here that's been set up called the approver. Whatever the user ID is not really significant here, but it is how you set up that user and the permissions and the preferences that are given to that user that are very important in terms of whether or not this operation is going to work favorably for you. So let's go in and just take a look at how the user is set up and some of the key elements here. One of the first things is that you'll want to make sure that you have an established email address for that approver, because part of the approval process is communicating to the person who's been designated as the, or the number of people that have been identified as approvers have an email address that is attached to their user ID. And you can see that I do have one here that's been attached. The second thing is that the user at least minimally has to be a business user. It cannot be an employee user. So we must have that approver or approvers that are selected for business users. Now, as far as administrative privileges are concerned, that is really up to you in terms of what this approver's responsibilities and what their allowance to do within the system. But typically we think of people who are approving within this part of the system as not having, or maximally, I guess I could say, is limited administrative privileges to absolutely no administrative privileges. So this is the first element of that. The next thing is I'm going to move over to preferences. So if we look at the preferences on this particular user and go down to an area that's called request for approval, and there are a couple of considerations here. One is that that particular approver or any other approvers must have this checkbox payment request marked. That is a very significant element. Without this checkbox marked, that approver will not be getting any kind of request through email to come back into the system and approve selected payments, selected bills. Now, the other element of this is deciding whether or not this particular approver is going to get an individual email on every bill that is selected that requires approval, or whether or not it will be consolidated. Consolidated would be is during the check processing run, that is, the first process is to select payments. When you go through and select a series of payments, and there may be more than one that the approver is going to need to approve, we're either going to send out individual emails on a per bill basis or either a consolidated one bill that represents the selection process. So depending upon how you want to have that come to the approver. So if we're talking about over 100 invoices, different invoices for a vendor that's going to need approval for payment, that approver could get as many as 100 different emails with this selected versus a consolidated one email indicating there are bills that have been selected for payment that need approval. Now, the last thing here is this box that will allow you to set minimum limit, meaning that there's a dollar threshold that this particular individual will be expected to get an email. So anything, let's say, for example, $100 and above will be sent, the approver will be sent an email indicating that there is waiting for them to go through the selection process and approve. So this is something that you may want to consider as well. I would say that as you're going through here and considering how you may roll this out through your company is to perhaps experiment around a little bit with this with one approver and see what is going to be the best workable solution for you in terms of individual versus consolidated versus setting a minimum here. The next thing that you see here is approval confirmations. Normally we think of the person who is going to approve the bills that have been selected to be paid is not the same person who's going to get an email notification or an approval confirmation that they already selected and approved bills. This would be something that a person who is going to be in the chain of understanding what has been approved, that this would be getting a confirmation that approvals have been made. So this is just another consideration here. All right, so that is under preferences. The next thing that I want you to consider here are the permissions, or what is noted here as being the subscriptions. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. And what I've done with this particular user, approver, is that I've narrowed down very finely and minutely, if you will, in terms of their access points within the system. Again, this goes back to whether or not this approver has other responsibilities in other parts of the system, or whether or not this person is just only going to come in and approve selected bills so that they can move along during the payment process. So there are some minimums here that have to be answered. And according to the company permissions, these are some of the things that I've given to this individual, particularly having to do with looking at departments and the dimensions here, listing and viewing. As you can see, there's really no changing or editing that I give this permissions to, but I've given at least for this approver, particularly if we're using dimensions, for at least for them to view those dimensions. And you can see the list of dimensions that we have out here in this sample company. I've also decided that this individual needs to look or view at the reporting periods. There's also the territory, which belongs as an assignment to vendors, and also attachments to our bills as they're being entered into the system, and a few other things, and particularly having to do with dashboards and even going as far as allocations. So just some of the minimal kinds of things within the company area. Not a whole lot, but just a few things. The next thing is under the accounts payable. And I think this is one of a very critical element that you really do need to consider. And I'm going to tie this area back once we get into accounts payable the accounts payable configuration, where we're actually going to turn on the approval process, or where it's been turned on. So minimally, what I've allowed this individual to do is to approve payments. I also wanted to give them the ability to being able to list bills and view them, but not make any additions, posts, or deletes, or any kind of changes here. I've also assigned this person to only be what's called a level 1 approver. Now, this will make a little more sense as we get into the AP configuration in terms of what these levels are. But think of this, is that within the accounts payable approval process and the way in which we may view certain selected bills to pay, we may believe that there are certain dollar limits that certain individuals can or cannot approve. And what essentially the levels are is a way within our approval part of the system is to set up monetary limits in terms of what we will allow certain individuals to approve. So as an example, perhaps I may want to have my user ID called approver here only approve bills from a penny up to $1,000, and I could set that up as a level inside of the accounts payable approval part of the system. But anything that might exceed $1,000 that would possibly go into level 2, 1,000 to 5,000, let's say, for example, that would require a level 2 approver to being able to approve that type of bill for payment, and that could conceivably be assigned to another individual who is part of the approval chain. Can a approver have more than one level assignment? Absolutely, if that is the way in which you want them to do. So in my example, we could theoretically have the approver not only approve from 0 to 1,000, but also from 1,000 to 5,000. We can do that, or just alone, just only from 1,000 to 5,000. And again, it depends upon, one, how I set up my dollar limits, whether or not I need to use multi-level approval and have certain individuals, more than just one, that go through the select and approve process based on dollar limits. All right. The other thing has to do with manual checks, and we'll get into this a little bit as we look at the configuration of the accounts payable setup for approval. But manual checks are a thing that we can record in the system. This would be a check that has been written outside of the system, and we need to record it against an open invoice, so we can have an approval process against that. We can also, if we're going to have the system print a check out for us on a one-by-one basis, i.e. also known as a manual check, do we want to have that approved before the user who is putting in the manual check, before it gets printed, that it goes through an approval process? And you'll see that as one of the elements that we can choose, either allow or either not allow here for approval during the approval process. So that's another consideration that you need to have here. Other than that, there isn't really a whole lot else that this particular approver is going to be able to do within the accounts payable system. Now, also, by the way, is that Intacct has also made it available for individuals to get email notifications onto their smartphones and have the ability to follow a link back into Intacct that is specially designed for smartphones in order to go through the approval process. I cannot very well show those screens to you here, but it is a very easy process, and especially for someone who might be an approver that might be traveling and not have direct access to a computer, could use their smartphone, get a notification that there are certain bills that have been selected to pay, of which they need to participate in the approval process. So that I want to bring to your attention is also available through a smartphone, and it really is not requiring any additional licensing. As long as that smartphone has the ability of getting email and has the ability to get onto the internet, that person who has that phone and is designated the approval can approve those selected bills. Those are considerations for the user. The email, the preferences, the permissions that we need to take in consideration along the way. So one of the things that we do need to keep in mind here that I mentioned a little earlier is that an employee user cannot be an approver here in the accounts payable system. And also, you'll want to make sure that the person who is going to be putting in the bills, and let's take a look at that person, and that person is this person here, and let's go over to the subscriptions here and go down to accounts payable. So I'm logged in as admin. This is the user ID for that. We're going to go into permissions here, and one of the things is that you want to make sure that the person or persons who are putting in the bills are not also the same people who are going to be expected to approve payments. You could give a person who is entering in the bills approval process list and all the levels, or at least one of the levels, and have that permissible for the person entering in the bill. The system will react to that by that person putting in the bill will have automatically approved their own selections. So it sounds circular, but just as a note to carry away here is that the person or persons who are going to be in selecting the bills are not the same ones who are going to approve. Otherwise, there will be no email sent out to any one of the designated approvers, and the selections will automatically be approved. Okay, let's just talk a little bit about how we go in and configure. I will lead up to what the normal accounts payable process is before we actually put this in place. But our next step is going through and enabling the accounts payable payment approvals within the system. So just bear in mind is that once this is turned on, Intacct will begin to behave accordingly to your approval. So as you naturally have gone through and placed bills in the system, selected them, and immediately gone on to the payment process, once this process or this approval process has been turned on, that there will be a place within Intacct there. You will not be able to reach print checks until you've actually exercised that approval process. So just be aware of that when you turn that on. So let's go into the setup of accounts payable. We're going to go into configure accounts payable. This is where we're going to find this at. If this is your first time through and looking at this, there's an awful lot here. For those of you who may have been through this one time before very earlier and just now coming back to revisit it, again, there's an awful lot to consider. But we're going to move down to the lower part of the screen here, where we're going to come into an area, as I scroll down, called Payment Approval Settings. So what this is an area that if you've not had it already turned on, the area that you see underneath the checkbox called Enable AP Payments Approval will not show until you've checked this box. So if I turn this off, then you'll notice this is going to be your normal appearance in terms of how that's going to look when you come into this screen. Okay, I'm going to re-enable this. Okay. And by enabling this is showing to you a couple of things that you need to make sure of that you are going to have identified for the Intacct system so that it knows how you want the approval process to work within the accounts payable system. So if you recall, when we were looking at the approver and the permissions of the subscriptions under the accounts payable permissions, there were those level selections. I wanted you to keep that in mind after describing a little bit about that, but here they are. And essentially what this is allowing you to set up different levels, different hierarchical levels in terms of the amounts that you may want to deploy in terms of who is going to approve what amount of a check that is about to be written to a vendor. So you can have as minimally as one level assigned, or you can use as many as 6. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a limit for $100. And what this is really saying here is saying that anyone who has been marked as a level 1 approver in our system, $100 and above is what that person will be asked to approve. If I were to set another limit here and saying that $1,000 was the next level, this would indicate that any bill that is asking to be paid or approved, users who are marked as level 1 users would be confronted with having to approve bills that are $100 and up to $999.99, up to. This is the minimal amount for $1,000. Anyone that was a level 2 approver would have $1,000 and above, unless I selected another limit here, which could be something like $5,000 and maybe a penny. And possibly this might make more sense that we had this as a penny. So first user level is $100 through $1,000. The next level is $1,000 and a penny up through $5,000. Third level is $5,000 and above, and on and on and on. Now, I also have a selection out here to the right of each one of these levels indicating the number of approvers that are going to be required in order for a bill to be approved to be paid. So when I look at this, is that I may say that I want 1 out of all of the approvers have been marked as level 1 to approve. So once I get 1 approval on anything that is $100 up to $1,000 in this case, then the bill can move on to the payment process. If I have, let's say for example, 2 approvers that must sign off on bills between $1,000 and a penny and $5,000, then the system will not confirm the bills that fall within that value amounts that they have been approved until I have 2 level 2 approvers to sign off. So this is something that you need to consider and talk about within your organization of what makes most sense in terms of who's going to approve, whether or not you're going to set value limits on those individuals who are going to be in the approval chain, and then how many on a per value level as to how many people will be required to sign off before the bill can move on to its last step, and that is to the payment process. So just for today's sake, I'm going to eliminate this and just have anything from $100 on up for my level 1 approval. Now, so perhaps the question is what happens for everything from 0 up to $99.99? Those bills that have been selected will automatically be approved. So they will not go through the approval chain process if they fall below that amount. Well, if all bills are needed to be approved, perhaps what I will set is here as a penny. And then anything from a penny and above is going to have to go through an approval process. In my case here, I selected $100. So anything that exceeds $100 is going to have to go through an approval process and is going to be approved by those that are level 1, and we have at least 1 out of all my approvers that are going to sign off and for the bill to move on to its next stage. All right? So that is the grid that we need to pay particularly attention to. Now the question is whether or not that is something that fits within your organization in terms of how things get approved for accounts payable. May or may not work here. What we have done is for those times when a certain payment process does not fit this type of strategy that the accounts payable system is offering, we may look at the purchase order system to give us a hand to get into a little more complexity and maybe possibly a better way to fit your way of approving invoices within the system. Can you have both the purchase order system with its own approval system as well as the accounts payable system approval process working conjunctively with one another? Absolutely. You certainly can. They're just offering up two different types of approvals within the system. As I said a little earlier, the purchase order system has a much deeper complexity, but you can think of this as that the purchase order system, in contrast to accounts payable, allows us to approve invoices before they come into accounts payable, contrasted with accounts payable bills being selected to pay. All right. Next thing that we need to consider is ignore manual check approval limit. Okay. So this means that manual checks, if they're going to be written out of the system, are not going to be part of this approval process. So someone who's going to go in and write a manual check out of the system and record an invoice, as an example, will not have to have that kind of thing approved within the system. Not all people have turned on or at least given permissions to use that part of the system, but for those of you who do, this is something that is part of the consideration, especially when it comes to accounts payable approval process. The next thing here is, who are we going to contact once the approver has signed off on the bill to be paid, and now the bill is ready for its next step in accounts payable? This is where we're going to declare that. And what we're really saying here by this selection is that the person who selects the bills, it may be different than the person who enters in the bills, but the person who selects the bills for payments is the one that's going to be notified that the bills have been approved, or bill has been approved, however many we have here, and that the bills are ready to go on to their next step, which is the payment process. Now, you could theoretically have a person who's entering in bills that has permissions to do that, that does not have the permissions to select bills to pay. You could also have a person who only has selection permissions but not payment permissions. So perhaps maybe my next step would be to contact someone else in my list of users out here that I would want to send an email to so that they could come back in the system and take the bills on to their next step. So normally we think about the person who's selecting the bills for payment is also going to be the same person who's going to be paying those bills at the same time. So I'm going to leave that. So the person who is going to be selecting the bills in my example today will be the admin. The person who's going to be approving the bills to be paid will be the approver, and then the admin will also be the person who's going to be carrying on to the next step of printing checks. So that's setting up the accounts payable part of the system for the approval process. The next thing that I want to do is I want to just review just the overall entering bill process, selecting bills to pay, and print checks. If you see the menu here, and regardless of whether or not you use the pull-down menus or whether or not you use the graphic menus, really is not going to make any difference, whatever is most comfortable for you to use. But just as an overview, is that typically we think about entering in bills in this area right here. This is where we will set up a bill that we're going to identify from an invoice that has come in, and we're going to get it entered into the system, and we're going to post it. Once the bill has been posted, the bill sets inside of the accounts payable as an open invoice, waiting for its next step. It could be that it might be an adjustment that may get assigned to it. For example, a debit or credit adjustment. Perhaps maybe the original invoice that was sent out was incorrect, and the vendor needed to send an adjustment to that particular bill by sending either a debit or a credit memo. So there perhaps is something that we may need to enter in as well as along the way. But typically this is where we think about bills getting entered in either in draft or either they are posted to the system and actively ready to be paid. The next step is then we're readying ourselves for selecting bills to pay. And when we select bills to pay, there's a filter screen that we use in order to select those bills that we are going to put in position to pay, albeit whether or not it's checks or whether or not it's ACH or whether or not it's record transfer, or even perhaps if we're going to record a credit card payment against those. Either way, we go through and we make that selection here in this particular area. Now, What's different now that we do have the approval process is that typically bills once selected, the next step for them was to have checks printed or payments recorded against them. We didn't have this intermediary process called approved payments here. And the only reason why approved payments is grayed out is because my user ID that I'm in as the admin has not been given rights to approve payments. And again, if you recall what I said something a little earlier, is that if you put in a bill and you select the bill and you've also been given rights to approve, you may find yourself that you placed the bill in, selected the bill, and it's ready to print a check automatically without actually going through the approval process. So you need to be careful of that, but that's one of the reasons why this is not available for me to use here. One of the other things is it's not always well known is viewing payment requests. And viewing payment requests, for those of you, and we sometimes get calls on this, is a way for a person who has access to this area is to look at everything that has been selected. Not approved, but been selected. And this is an area also that can also allow you to cancel the request for consideration for payment. So this is something that could be even post-approved or either pre-approved, that an individual who may have made a mistake as to what was selected and we wanted to cancel the request for that, we can come in here and do that. I don't have anything selected here. That's the reason why you don't see that. And perhaps what we'll do is once we get a bill in and selected, you will see, and we'll come back and look at that. The next step after selection is printing. So we do have this intermediary step, and this is really what we're all here for, is to get a good close look at what that next step is through the approval process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enter in a bill into the system. I've already got one out here already, and you can see that it's posted, but at this point in time it has not been selected. So I'm going to add another bill out here just for another consideration. All right, and this is where I'm going to go through, and I'm just simply going to put the bill in and populate it as we go along here. Selecting my vendor, putting in a bill number, terms come up automatically, the due date is automatically computed, the recommended to pay date is your way of placing a date on the invoice if there is a recommendation, which allows you to filter that during the selection process. We're also going to identify what this bill is all about. The other thing to consider are the attachments. I don't know how many of you are using attachments within the system, but Intacct gives you a fairly easy way of placing attachments in the system, especially when it comes to their drag and drop. I'm going to try to demonstrate that here real quick so that you can all see that. I have a PDF document that I'm going to attach here, and I'm just going to pull it down and drag it over the attachment area, and you can see that it automatically went through and attached this. One of the other things that you may want to consider is, especially on document numbering, is that when you assign documents or attach documents to any part of the system wants you to ID the attachment. So I set up a numbering system here that automatically IDs every attachment, so I don't have a lot of maintenance that I have to go through and a lot of questions I have to answer when I'm attaching documents. So I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. All right, so we're going to come down here. Now we're going to go through and do the GL allocation of the bill here. Down and find a good expense account to place this against. And we'll just put this in benefits. Actually, we'll find something a little bit different. Here's insurance right here, general insurance that we'll assign this to. And the amount is going to be $3,000. I can use allocation, but I'll just go ahead and here and assign this to a department as I'm moving along. These are the dimensions that I've set up in my sample company. Okay, there's the memo. And I can continue to allocate this bill, but I'm going to say that we are finished with this bill entry. And our next step is to post. We could post and go on to a new entry to continue on to enter in our bills, or else we could save it as a draft before we actually post it, thereby not allowing it to become part of a selection process until it's actually been posted. So I'm just going to simply go through here and I'm going to post. And the system is ready for me to enter in the next bill. So we could go through here and enter bills in, but now the time has come to where we are now going to go through and select bills to pay. That will be our next step. So I will go through here and select our bills, and I'm just going to put a due date. I have a lot of data in here, so I'm going to try to eliminate too much data showing up as I go through the approval process here. There are my two bills. Standard procedure here in terms of selecting bills to pay. Again, the considerations along the way, the payment method that we're going to use, and you can see that either we're going to use check, charge card, recorded transfer, cash, or either ACH. In this case, we're going to be record checks against this. We will have two different vendors that we are going to be writing checks towards. We've identified the bank. The payment request method, use vendor preference. This really goes back to when the vendor was set up as to whether or not you wanted one check per bill for each vendor or for the vendor you were setting up, or whether or not you wanted to consolidate. The default for vendors when they get set up in the system is to consolidate bills onto one check. You have the choices in this case of either overriding what those vendor preferences are or either mandating how you want to do it regardless of what the vendor preference is. All right? So we'll leave it at that. And then the payment date that is projected to pay the bill. Right? Next step is to come down and select the bills that we're going to pay. I'm going to select both of them here. This is the one that I had entered in a little earlier. This is the one that I entered in while we were together today. We're going to go ahead and pay full on this bill. So we'll have the amounts automatically filled in under amount to pay. And now my next step is to save. And once I save at this point is when the activity for the approval process begins. And what we should see is that an email should be generated to the approver that there have now been bills that have been selected to pay. In that email, there will also give you a hyperlink to follow back into the Intacct system, allowing that user to log in and come to the area of approving the bills that have been selected or declining the bills that have been selected. So I'm going to hit the save here, and I have another email area opened up that I want to go to, and right here it is. This is another email address that was associated with the approver. Okay, and if you'll notice here, we do have two emails. And if we look through this email, it addresses Harley-Davidson approver. The date that was submitted was on the 16th. The requester is the admin in the system. The vendor is Akimi Technologies for $1,200. We're going to print a check. And it says, click here to view the transactions. Once you do that, you have these following instructions to look at and consider. Review the payment, so you're going to sign in. You're going to select the Accounts Payable application menu. You're going to go to Approve Payments from the Activities menu, and then view the payment request by clicking on the details. Now, once you've done that, you're going to have to make a decision as to whether or not you're going to approve or decline. So you view the payment request, any comments and that you may want to include. So you're either going to approve or decline. If we approve, then the bill that has been selected will be allowed to move on to its next stop, and that is at the print process. If you decline, confirmation will go back both for the approvals and both for those that have been declined to, in this case, the admin, who will have to either move on with payments or either fix whatever is wrong with one that has been declined, but it will be kept out of the payment process until something is done with it, and that is resubmitted for the approval process. And part of adding comments by the approver would at least indicate to the person who selected the payments, waiting for the confirmations, to understand why there might have been a decline on a certain set of bills or a bill. And then, if you wish, you can approve and decline entering comments if you wish. Okay? So those are the instructions. This next email was on the second bill that was selected. Now, if you recall, when we were setting up the approver, there was a selection whether or not we were going to be sending out individual emails or whether or not we were going to consolidate. Now, if we had it selected for consolidate, there would only have been one email sent out to D. Caldwell, the approver here, and only one email that would at least explain what it was that was being requested of them, and a hyperlink to go back in, and then also to see both bills available for them to either approve or decline along the way. What I'm going to do next here is that I'm going to go ahead and click here on to view the transaction. So this is the approver who got the email now is going to go in and respond to this email request by either approving or declining. So let's go ahead and click that. So the hyperlink actually did a lot for us here. It actually took us directly into the approved payment section of Intacct, taking them directly in here and showing them the bills that are being asked of them and that have now been submitted to be paid. You'll also notice here, based on the permissions that were given to the approver, how limited of an area that this approver or this user can navigate. Okay, and this again is going back to the permissions that were assigned to them. Now, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the admin. I have two different browsers open here. One is for the approver, Harley-Davidson, the approver, and then also the admin is still open. But one thing I promised you is I wanted to show you view payment request, and we'll leave this screen here. And you can see that the payments that have been, or the bills that have been selected for payment request or payments, also are here and available for the admin user, because the admin user has permissions in this area, to cancel the request. So if the admin had some issues with what was going on about what's been approved, that person could come in here and cancel the request, and thereby automatically restarting the process of selecting and approving to be considered. So just want you all to see that that was available either pre-approval or post-approval. So let's go back to our other screen. Here we are. I'm going to approve one and decline the other here. So what I'm going to do is I'm looking at this. I have the ability to drill down and look at this a little more if I need to understand a little more about this. Perhaps there's something on this particular bill that I may need to look at a little more and try to understand. There's a couple of hyperlinks here. I can also see that there's an attachment to this bill. But a couple of other things here is the history. And what's being kept on all these bills as they go through the selection process and approval process and perhaps decline and then reapproval, all of that history in terms of who touched this will be recorded in the history tab on this bill. And this is kind of interesting, especially if for some reason a bill does become declined and we're trying to understand why and who was in the process. An individual who has rights to coming in and taking a look at this has that kind of history and can certainly get a little better handle on what the part of the bill in its life is throughout the system. Comments that might have been attached, okay, along the way, but this is also a place where the approver can attach comments along the way, which will also be a part of what will be kept with the bill. I'm going to just simply approve it from this location. If I can also go through and decline, but you'll notice that once I approve that, under the approved payments, that particular bill is no longer there and allowing me to do anything else with that bill. So the admin user should be getting an email indicating that there has been an approval made. And we'll take a look at that a little bit. But in this case, I'm going to say, you know what, we just cannot pay this bill right now. We're going to decline. So I'm going to hit the decline. I can add a comment, much the same way as what I did a little earlier by going in and drilling down on it and finding the section called comments. So there's the reason why I'm declining it. I need a little better understanding about the bill and how it's going to be allocated to different departments and just not one. Okay, and now it's been declined. So now at this juncture, that bill will now have to go back through the selection process and the approval process, and then eventually the payment process should it ever become approved. But now there is something that we need to do with that bill a little bit differently than what it was when it was first entered in. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back here and I'm going to check to see if I've gotten an email, that is the admin person who's got an email that there's been confirmations. And there has. You can see that there are 2 emails that this person has gotten, the admin, that happens to be me here, and it says, by the way, we have approved with a comment approved based on adequacy of funds. This is saying to the admin person to log in and then go to the payment request screen and the status and then go through the normal process of approving. And here is the payment that we're approving that you may move ahead with and paying that bill. And again, this is something that could be consolidated as well and doesn't necessarily need to have multiple emails on a per bill basis. I'm going to select the other one, the other email, which has to do with one that was declined. And in this case, it was declined and need more documentation as to which department this intended. And then it just simply says that you may go back in and review the payment history on this, or the history on this bill, perhaps to get a little better understanding of why this thing may have been declined. All right? So emails have gone out, and approvals have been made, as well as a decline on one of them. So the communication went out to the approver. The approver made the selection as to whether or not they were going to approve or decline. Confirmations went back to the person that we indicated was getting the approvals. This case was the admin person who was going to be the next person that was going to continue on with the payment process and perhaps maybe going back and readjusting the bill that was declined and then going through the submission process again. Now, one of the things that Intacct has done here recently is that, and we don't have time to demonstrate this today, but there is what is known as Chatter. And Chatter is a system that Intacct has added, allowing individuals to chat back with one another within the system to further explain activities, request activities. It's almost your own Twitter within Intacct, if you will, to facilitate communication. So I want you to be looking for that, because that is coming up as a release. It is part of the permissions that you need to turn on in the system in order for people to begin to use that. All right, well, let me just quickly recap. I think we're at the end of our session today. So again, one of the things that you can turn on, the features within the accounts payable system, is the ability to being able to approve selected bills to pay. Contrast it against bills that have been in the system and being posted. We cannot approve bills to be posted. That is something that either someone has the rights to do or not the rights to do. There is no approval process there at that point. However, there is an approval process at the point when bills have been selected to pay, and that based on the number of approvers, the permissions that approvers have, and the monetary levels that they've been given rights to approve, we'll all work together in terms of notifying approvers once bills have been selected that they have an obligation to coming in and either approving or declining bills that have been selected. Once that approval or decline has been made, the confirmation has been sent back through an email to a certain other user ID within the system. It could have been the person who selected the bills, or it could be a different individual. But it normally would be expected that person who's carrying on with the next step in the system, and that is typically the payment process. There are very important things to consider here, especially during when you set up the users in terms of their levels, the areas that you need to attend to in terms of their preferences, in terms of their restriction and how they're identified either as a business user or as an employee user. We again said that they didn't need to have administrative rights to come in and approve. There was some consideration in terms of how much navigation area that you're going to give those approvers. Perhaps they have other responsibilities, or in my case here, the approver had very limited access points within the system. It was pretty much narrowed down to either dashboard or either approving. So those are some of the considerations that you need to have as far as the users are concerned. My best recommendation to you is to start out slowly, try to identify a couple of users before you expand out the approval process, maybe system-wide, so at least you can test some of your theories about how you want that into the system to work and whether or not it's going to work with a good degree of adequacy. And then lastly, I just want to mention is that the purchase order part of the system is a much more comprehensive type of approval process, and instead of approving checks to be paid, it is actually approving invoices within the system that can be posted to the accounts payable system with a higher degree of selections and who shall approve and who cannot approve within the system. So with having said that, thank you for letting me come into your hour of the day. I know you're all busy, and hopefully this was informative and rewarding to you and give you some considerations to turning on that feature in the system for approvals. If you're finding that possibly that the accounts payable system just does not have enough of security, or at least multiple levels of types of approvals that you may want, we may want to consider venturing into the purchase order part of the system and talking a little more further about that, how maybe purchase order might be able to satisfy some of your approval requirements. Other than that, I wish you all a great day. Thanks again.